Hi, my name is Anna. I'm about to turn 33 and I work in an office for a local company. Even though I'm an adult, I still live with my dad because I haven't moved out yet. My mom passed away when I was little, so my dad and grandparents raised me. We live in a building where my grandparents used to run a small grocery store on the first floor. After my mom died, my dad, who was a chef, decided to change the grocery store into a bakery. He did this so he could be around more to take care of me. As a little girl, I understood why he made this change. He wanted to see me off to school in the morning and be there to welcome me home in the afternoon. The bread my dad baked was simple but very tasty. People in our community loved it, and the bakery became a popular spot. When regular customers saw me in the shop, they always asked how I was doing in school. I missed my mom a lot and sometimes cried myself to sleep. My dad and grandparents were very loving and always tried to comfort me. Many other people in our community also looked out for me, so I never felt alone or unlucky. Eventually, I grew up and it was time for me to get married. My fiancé is Eric Wolf, and he works at the same office as me. He's a very active person and plays on a company sports team. Because he was always hungry after his sports practices, I sometimes brought him my dad's bread. Ken loved the bread so much and thought it was amazing to eat it every day. He was so impressed that he wanted to meet my dad and thank him. Ken came over to our house and got along with my dad right away. My dad used to joke that if he weren't a baker, he would have a big dog. He really liked Ken and saw him as a gentle giant. On weekends, my dad and Ken would go fishing or to my dad's favorite bar. My dad would proudly introduce Ken as his son. I used to joke with them, saying, "Hey, I want to spend time with Ken too." But my dad would laugh and say, "Nope, I'm taking him for barbecue today." We joked around a lot and felt like a real family. When Ken proposed to me, I was very happy. However, we had one problem. The wedding was 6 months away, and I was supposed to move into Ken's apartment after we got married. Ken was busy with his sports team on weekends, so I started cleaning his apartment and making space for my things. I also cooked for him while I waited for him to come home, imagining our life together. One day, while I was at Ken's apartment, his mother, Mrs. Wolf, came over. She had a spare key and let herself in without knocking. She immediately complained, saying, "It stinks of bread here. Do you even take a shower every day?" I apologized and said, "I'm sorry, our bathroom often smells like freshly baked bread." She just sneered and replied, "Your bread smells like low lives." Despite this, I tried to stay positive and looked forward to my future with Ken. One day, Ken's mom asked me, "Why don't you tell your dad to use better ingredients and follow the latest trends in baking? Does he use French butter or organic fruits?" I replied, "No, he buys the butter from a local supplier and the fruits from the neighborhood grocer." She scoffed and said, "It's not good to be careless about such things. Don't come crying to me if his business fails." "Yes, ma'am," I said, trying to keep the peace even though I felt she was being unreasonable. I used to argue with her every time, but I stopped because it was pointless. Even when I agreed with her, she wasn't satisfied and just became more sarcastic. She'd say things like, "I wonder why Ken chose such a dull girl." I went to great lengths to raise him to be handsome, smart, and athletic. I would agree to keep the peace, saying, "Yes, it's a mystery." She'd respond, "Don't just agree with me. You should try to improve yourself. I still don't accept you as a daughter-in-law." "Got it," I would say, feeling frustrated. I often wondered how Ken turned out to be such a great guy despite having such a difficult mother. She often made rude comments about me, comparing me to bread. "You have a face like a stuffed roll. Do you keep a loaf of bread in your stomach? Your arms are like challah bread," she would sneer. I felt her comments were not only disrespectful to me but also to bread. Once, she asked to try some of my dad's bread. When I brought it to her, she took one bite and then dismissed it, showing off an expensive Danish pastry she had bought from a famous hotel. Ken's father wasn't much different. He worked for a company with several sales offices in the country. A few years ago, he was transferred to our town as the director of the sales office. He worked hard to become influential in the community, which I thought was impressive. But he looked down on us, just like his wife did. Even though I could tolerate their rudeness, the stress built up over time. Ken got fed up with his parents and moved out, even though their house was close to his work. He tried to protect me from their negativity, but when he wasn't around, there wasn't much I could do. Frankly, if it weren't for Ken, I wouldn't want to have anything to do with such rude people. One day, Ken's father called us over to their house. As soon as we arrived, he handed us a piece of paper. "Here is the guest list for the wedding," he said. There were about 50 names on the list. "Who are these people?" "I don't know any of them except for my relatives," I said. "Isn't it amazing? My business partners want to attend the reception," Ken's father said, looking proud. Ken frowned and asked, "Why do we need to invite so many of your people? We're only renting a venue for 130, so it's impossible." Ken's father just shrugged, looking pleased with himself, while we tried to figure out what to do next. "Why don't you just cut back on your guest list?" Ken suggested. His father replied, "It's only fair for us, an upper-class family, to invite more guests. The wedding of our eldest son is also an occasion to show our family's power." Ken glared at his father and said, "I've never heard of such a thing." His mother interrupted, "That's right. It's the custom of high society. If you are the eldest son in our family, there are a lot of people we need to please, unlike Amy, who's from a lower class." "Don't talk like that," Ken snapped. I stared at them coldly, while Ken trembled with anger beside me. I didn't want to stoop to their level. I glanced through the names on the guest list and then turned to Ken. "It's okay, Ken," I said. Then, addressing his parents, I added, "I agree with you, Mr. and Mrs. Wolf. Let's keep 850 seats for your guests, 40 for our colleagues, and 80 for my side. Is that good enough?" "Amy," Ken started, surprised by my response. His mother said, "I'm impressed that you are so agreeable. Don't forget your status on the day." "Yes, ma'am," I replied innocently. Ken looked like he wanted to protest, but I dragged him out of the house. "I'm sorry, Amy," he said on the way back. "I promised we'd have a small wedding with just close friends and family." "Don't worry," I said. "Your parents would be there anyway, no matter what. Besides, looking at the guest list, it doesn't seem so bad." "Huh?" Ken asked, confused. "There are several familiar names among the invited guests," I explained. "I'll show them the true power of a baker's daughter. After all the disrespect they've shown me, I'm not going to keep my head down. I'm going to turn the tables." I didn't want my dad, who was truly excited about our marriage, to worry, so I endured their insults quietly. But I realized I was wrong. If I didn't fight back, I would be their slave for the rest of my life. Ken was taken aback by my determination and then laughed, saying, "That's my woman." "Hey, can I make a suggestion?" he asked. "What is it?" I replied. "We can register our marriage after the reception," he suggested. "What?" I was puzzled by his unexpected proposal, but his eyes were serious. "Okay," I agreed, deciding to trust my soon-to-be husband. Then came the wedding day of the Williams and Wolf families. Walking down the aisle and throwing rice, the ceremony went smoothly and the reception was about to begin. After fixing my hair and makeup, I entered the hall arm in arm with Ken, ready to face whatever came next. "Abby," "Beautiful Amy," "Hey," "The cutest baker." Cheers and yells erupted from the entire room. It wasn't just my friends and family who were cheering, even the groom's side joined in. I could see the stunned face of Mr. Anders and the hateful look from Mrs. Wolf, which made me grin. Ken's father had invited many important people, including landowners and other influential figures. But it was too bad for him because all those powerful people were regular customers at our bakery. I had known them like aunties and uncles since I was a child. "Amy, you've grown up to be a beautiful woman," Mrs. Stephan said. "Thank you, Mrs. Stephan," I replied. "I can't believe that the girl who used to kick my sons but is married now," Mr. Peter joked. "Oh, Mr. Peter," I laughed. "You used to catch frogs and stuff them in a box, and now you look so graceful," Mrs. Gustav said. "Thank you, Mrs. Gustav," I replied. "You tried to eat the mushrooms growing in the park, but now you look amazing in that dress," Mr. Henrik added. "Please, Mr. Henrik," I blushed. They all talked fondly, but couldn't they find more decent stories to share? Ken listened pleasantly, but my face was burning red. When I received the invitation from Mr. Anders, I was going to decline. But then I saw your name as the bride, so I accepted. They all said the same. It made me laugh because they felt more like my guests after all. While Mr. and Mrs. Wolf went around greeting each guest, they seemed to have been told about my childhood. Both of them were smiling, but I knew they must have been fuming inside. They wanted to show off their power, but instead, they saw the strength of my family connections. My colleagues and bosses were also fans of my dad, who always treated them with his bread. They surrounded my dad and seemed to be having a great time. Despite the tension behind the scenes, the reception continued joyfully with meals, toasts, and speeches from the guests. But then a big incident happened. When it was time for Ken's father to give his speech, his mother snatched the microphone from him. Ignoring the murmuring audience, she began to speak clearly. Ken was brilliant from childhood. He always won first prize in everything. "He's our precious son," she said. Well, that's a bit of an overpraise, I thought, but it showed how much she loved him. "But I regret that I didn't teach him how to choose the right woman for himself," she continued. Huh. I was shocked. As you all know, Amy is restless and careless and doesn't listen to what others have to say. "It's her wedding, but she's showing off her flabby arms," she said, trying to embarrass me in front of 130 guests. Even Mr. Anders turned pale with horror. "But she is the woman Ken has chosen. I will train her to be a good wife as her new mother." "Understood, Amy?" she asked, glaring at me and waiting for my consent. I couldn't just nod at this point. I have only one mother in this world. I refuse to accept such a wicked mother, I replied firmly. I didn't want to argue and lower myself in front of the guests. So I smiled and said, "Well, despite Ken being a wonderful man, he likes rough and fat women. Thanks to that, I'm lucky, right?" I jokingly looked over at Ken, who forced a smile despite his rage. "Amy is the most beautiful woman in the world. It's a shame my mom cannot see that," Ken replied. "Ken, you are being fooled by this woman," Mrs. Wolf snapped, sensing the mood. At that moment, a low, raspy voice rang out from next to me. "Is that all you have to say?" My dad glared at Mrs. Wolf with a face I had never seen before. Since she lost her mother at a young age, she may lack some femininity. Even so, she grew up to be a caring, kind daughter who is considerate of those around her. "I will not forgive you if you insult her," my dad said firmly. "What can a mere baker do?" Mrs. Wolf sneered. "My bread fills not only stomachs but hearts, unlike you, who can only look down on others," my dad retorted. Mrs. Wolf froze at Ken's sudden anger. He snatched the mic from her hand, took a deep breath, and turned to the guests with a perfect smile. "Thank you all for coming and celebrating this new chapter of our lives with us. We are deeply sorry that you had to witness such a shameful display. I am truly happy to have Amy as my wife, who is bright, energetic, and loved by others. I understand that you must be worried because her in-laws are such terrible people." Yeah. Shouts came from the groom's side's table. Mr. and Mrs. Wolf looked around with their eyes wide open. Please rest assured, I am cutting ties with them from this moment, and I will take the surname of Williams, Ken declared. What? Ken? Mrs. Wolf cried out in disbelief. The entire audience was stunned. My mouth dropped open too, hearing this for the first time. I assumed this was why he wanted to register our marriage after the wedding. There's no way I'm going to let that happen. No way. Mrs. Wolf protested. I don't need your approval, Ken said coldly. He turned to my dad and asked, Mr. Williams, I'm less than perfect, but will you accept me as your son? The hall fell silent. All eyes were on my dad, who remained calm, as if he already knew how Ken felt. I've already thought of you as my family for a long time, Ken. It's my pleasure. Please look after this tomboy of a daughter, he said warmly. They embraced each other. Congratulations! A loud shout came from the groom's side, triggering loud applause and words of congratulations. It brought tears to my eyes. I was the happiest person in the world. I wondered if my mother was watching me from somewhere at that moment. The whirlwind of blessings overwhelmed Mr. and Mrs. Wolf. The next day, we registered our marriage, and true to his words, Ken took up my surname. I was a bit worried that Ken might regret his decision to change his surname, but when he looked at his new driver's license with a relieved smile, I felt reassured. It turned out that Ken had already discussed changing his surname with my dad. He had told my dad all about his parents' behavior and how much he wanted to marry me, even crying during the conversation. My dad was so moved by Ken's sincerity that he grew even fonder of him. The bond between the two men was stronger than I had ever imagined, and it made me feel both happy and a bit jealous. One thing I knew for sure was that Ken was the best partner I could ever ask for. On the other hand, Ken's parents were furious about losing their son and threatened to cut all ties with him if he changed his surname. Ken accepted this without hesitation, which sent them into a panic. They had also alienated many of the wedding guests by insulting me. I can't trust you anymore, so I'm canceling our contract. I would not recommend your company to anyone. The director of the company is a lunatic. These comments and rumors quickly spread, causing the sales of Mr. Anders's company to plummet. In our town, where people valued loyalty and humanity, personal connections could either be a great strength or a pitfall. It was foolish of them to try to use others to show off their power without realizing the consequences. They were so troubled and perplexed that they resorted to begging and threatening us. Ken had no intention of forgiving them, which was a relief to me. Eventually, Mr. Anders received a phone call from the head office and was blamed and demoted for his mistakes. He was now looked down upon by his younger subordinates and worked in humiliation. Mrs. Wolf was also in despair, having lost her precious son to the woman she despised and seeing her husband demoted. Even her own relatives and friends began to avoid her after the wedding fiasco. Ken's younger sister also got fed up with their parents and stopped coming home, choosing to stay with her boyfriend instead. Everything they were proud of was gone, and only despair remained. Ken and I couldn't help but laugh at their self-inflicted downfall. 6 years have passed since then. Dad, the roles are done. I called out. Great, then help me with this one next, my dad replied. Okay, I said. 2 men were bustling around in the small kitchen, Ken and my dad. Ken started baking with my dad on weekends because he wanted to become a baker too. However, since he was successful in his job, he decided to stay as an office worker for a little longer. I quit my job when I got pregnant. Now, I sell my dad's bread online while taking care of our 2 kids. Ken didn't want the delicious bread to go to waste, so he built a website to sell it. The simple bread my dad bakes is easy to sell frozen, and sales have been quite good. Our kids enjoy the bread baked by my dad and Ken, and these peaceful days are the most precious thing in the world to me.